Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Poser. I'm the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Library and more than happy to welcome you to today's seminar. So with that, I'm very excited to turn this presentation over to our coordinator for it, Nina Przinski. So Nina, can you please introduce our speakers and today's seminar?
Thank you, Katie, for the introduction. Welcome to the NOAA Science Seminar, Early Encounters on the Western Frontier, The Search for Svyatoy Nikolai, which will be a presentation discussing findings from a remote sensing and archaeological survey of the Svyatoy Nikolai, a survey vessel for the Russian-American company that was lost at the turn of the 19th century in the waters of today's Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. This seminar series is co-hosted by the NOAA Ocean Exploration and the NOAA Central Library. My name is Nina Przinski, and I'm the Grant Science Support Coordinator working at NOAA Ocean Exploration in the Science and Technology Division, and also with the Ocean Exploration Cooperative Institute. I'm very excited to introduce you to our speakers today, Katie Wrubel and Madeline Roth. Katie is currently a Resource Protection Specialist at the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. She received her master's degree in environmental science at Washington State University, Vancouver, where she was a NOAA Dr. Nancy Foster Scholar. After graduate school, she was a Washington Sea Grant Mark Hirschman Marine Policy Fellow at the Nature Conservancy, where she focused on marine spatial planning with tribal and non-tribal partners. Prior to her current position, Katie worked as the Natural Resource Policy Analyst for the Makah Tribe in Mia Bay, Washington, for 6 years. Our other speaker today is Madeline Roth. She is a maritime archaeologist and currently pursuing an interdisciplinary PhD in coastal resource management at East Coast Carolina University, where her research addresses community participatory research and heritage governance in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands and Guam. Prior to this, Madeline worked for the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries Maritime Heritage Program. The project that we will be hearing about today was supported via the NOAA Ocean Exploration Fiscal Year 2023 funding opportunity. Thank you very much, Katie and Madeline, for your time and for choosing to share your exciting work with us today. I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you, Nina. Next slide. Maddie and I are sharing slides. As noted, my name is Katie Wrubel. I work at Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. Just wanting to provide a brief overview of the National Marine Sanctuary system. These are areas that are designated as federal marine protected areas that possess conservation, recreational, ecological, historical, scientific, educational, cultural, archaeological, or aesthetic qualities, which give them national significance. There is currently a network of 16 national marine sanctuaries and 2 marine national monuments, ranging from American Samoa to Selwyn Bank and Olympic Coast to Florida Keys. This covers an area of over 620,000 square miles of marine and Great Lake areas. And on this map, the yellow squares denote areas where sanctuaries are being considered for designation as well. Next slide. Our talk today is focused on a maritime heritage survey that was done in Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, and just want to give a broad overview of maritime heritage within national marine sanctuaries. Maritime heritage is the wide variety of tangible and intangible elements, so historic, cultural, and archaeological resources, which represent our human connections to the Great Lakes and ocean areas. So tangible resources are the ones that I think are probably most at the forefront of people's minds. These are pre-contact archaeological sites, historic shipwrecks, archival documents. Maritime heritage also includes the intangible resources such as oral histories, stories of indigenous cultures, and ecosystem services like sense of place. And they can also be natural resources with cultural value. In essence, these are all of the connections that people have with the marine and Great Lakes environments. Next slide. And under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act and the National Historic Preservation Act, the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries has a responsibility to identify and preserve both tangible and intangible maritime heritage resources within sanctuaries. And we do these in a variety of ways. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 110, we have a responsibility to identify and assess these resources. And under Section 106, we need to account for the effect or impact of federal undertakings, such as issuing permits on historic properties. Under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, we do have a requirement to support, promote, and coordinate scientific research on and long-term monitoring of resources within sanctuaries, which includes maritime heritage resources. Next slide. A little overview of our site, Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. It is actually the furthest north sanctuary that has been designated and the only in Washington State. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary, being designated in 1994. This sanctuary covers approximately 3,200 square miles off of the coast of Washington, from just west of Neah Bay down to the Copalis River, ranging from 25 to 40 miles offshore. It protects thriving intertidal zones, kelp forest habitats, deep sea communities, and maritime heritage resources. It's a large shelf area, but we do have several submarine canyon heads within the sanctuary boundaries. The sanctuary is also within the usual and custom fishing areas of 4 coastal treaty tribes, the Hoh tribe, Makah tribe, Aleut tribe, and the Quinault Indian Nation. And we work very closely with them on all of our research, resource protection, and education and outreach programming. And we have an intergovernmental policy council, which is made up of the 4 coastal treaty tribes in the state of Washington, advising the sanctuary, in addition to having a sanctuary advisory council in which each of the tribes have seats on that as well. Next slide. Our mission at Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary is to protect the natural and cultural resources through responsible stewardship, conduct and apply research to preserve the ecological integrity and maritime heritage, and to promote understanding through public outreach and education. And my last slide, you can go to the next slide, please. Olympic Coast has a rich maritime heritage where lives, languages, communities, and cultures are constantly shaped by the sea. The Hoh tribe, Makah tribe, Aleut tribe, and Quinault Indian Nation traditionally lived at the water's edge, thriving on the riches of the ocean, including plants, fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals. The waters that are now designated as a sanctuary were highways that linked Native peoples all along the coast as they traveled by canoe while mastering currents, weathers, and tides. The rugged Olympic coast can also be treacherous, especially during winter storms, when high winds and strong currents can push ships dangerously close to the rocky islands, reefs, and shoreline. Nearly 200 ships were wrecked or lost at sea in or near sanctuary waters between 1808 and 1972. At Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, we strive to understand and share these stories, and just emphasize again that maritime heritage continues to connect people to the sea today. And I'm going to turn it over to Maddie to dig into the project.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that wonderful introduction to the maritime heritage of Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. Just as a little bit of background, within the sanctuary program, there are individual sanctuaries such as Olympic Coast, as well as a headquarters division that has within it a maritime heritage program whose mission is very similar to Olympic Coast in that its aim is to share the maritime heritage through understanding and outreach and engagement across the entire marine sanctuary system. But one of the aims of the Maritime Heritage Program is also to support individual sanctuaries and the heritage preservation and educational programming and projects that they have ongoing. In the early 1990s through the early 2000s, the headquarters Maritime Heritage Program worked in partnership with staff at Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, as well as East Carolina University, to conduct some remote sensing projects off the coast of Washington State to identify potential historic resources. They identified several shipwreck sites during those surveys, but that was sort of really the last partnership that the Maritime Heritage Program had with Olympic Coast. And so one of the interest areas, certainly I would say 20 years later, was for the Maritime Heritage Program to reestablish some of those relationships with partners, especially on the West Coast, but really across the region. And so I was very fortunate during my time with the Maritime Heritage Program to basically create this project with Katie at Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. One of the things that we were really interested in was looking at maritime heritage resources within the sanctuary, areas that had both relationships to past and current communities out on the Olympic Peninsula. I'm a maritime archaeologist by training, and so when it came to thinking about a project, we decided that we could do sort of this tried and true archaeological project, which involves remote sensing, trying to identify these potential tangible heritage resources. Certainly, there is wonderful opportunity for really delving in and celebrating the intangible heritage aspects of the Olympic Peninsula. But because this was a relatively new sort of partnership, or really a partnership that has sort of fallen by the wayside, really we approached this entire project with the emphasis and intent of building relationships. And so through sort of this intent between the Maritime Heritage Program, Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, and East Carolina University, we partnered again 20 years after the fact to conduct a remote sensing survey off of La Push, Washington. The goal of this survey was to conduct a marine remote sensing survey, as well as a dive investigation of both some known shipwreck sites and any potential anomalies or targets that we identified in the survey to identify potential archaeological resources. And again, that secondary aim really was to work on some relationship building and to gain a better understanding of the interest in both promoting and preserving tangible and intangible maritime heritage resources located within the sanctuary boundary. The coast of Washington is pretty notorious when it comes to marine survey expeditions because of these incredible swells that build in the Pacific and come toward shore. As Katie noted, the winter swells in particular have a pretty nasty history of wrecking vessels, with the 200 potential sites lost within the sanctuary boundary. We chose to run our project last August, which has historically some of the better weather conditions for on-water survey. But when it came to thinking about where we wanted to work within the sanctuary, we chose La Push, Washington as our daily marina and sort of headquarters for operations, because it does have one of the few marina areas that is somewhat protected along Washington's coastline. The sanctuary research vessel, the research vessel Storm Petrel, or RV Storm Petrel, is actually located in La Push, Washington. And so it seemed like a good place for us to sort of base our survey operations from. Because there were so few marinas and really this very remote and sometimes hazardous rural coastline to both the north and south of La Push, we chose to focus our survey operations right around the marina itself. And this is an area that's actually been identified as a high priority for coastal mapping because of the difficulties in surveying so close to shore. When it comes to thinking about potential heritage resources located around La Push, one particular resource appears in the historical record, and that's the Russian-American company schooner, the St. Nikolai, or SV Nikolai. This was a vessel that was likely purchased from Hawaii in 1807 and actually transported to the Russian-American company headquarters, which were then located in Sitka, Alaska. The vessel was outfit for the express purpose of mapping the Pacific Northwest coastline. There was interest in the early 1800s of establishing a Russian-American company trading post further south, potentially in what is now Oregon State. And so the St. Nikolai was outfit to basically travel down the coastline through Alaskan, Washington, and now Oregon waters to identify potential areas for this new settlement, as well as conduct some fur trading with local populations. The vessel left Sitka in 1807 and began traveling south to identify this location for the new Albion colony. While it was passing off the coast of Washington State, storms brewed up and pushed the vessel inshore, unable to find a favorable wind. The crew actually navigated the SV Nikolai amongst the rocks and landed the vessel successfully on the beach, and the entire crew survived this wrecking event. What followed was actually a very tumultuous 2 years spent traveling across the Olympic Peninsula in search of rescue. Some of the crew did in fact survive this entire encounter and made their way back to Sitka, where one of the crew members published an account in Russian of the entire voyage, including a potential lost location of the vessel. So due to both the early nature of this vessel and really sort of the context within the really Pacific sphere that it was working within, it seemed of interest to us. And really, to understand, I think, the significance of SV Nikolai, it's important to look at this much larger context, which was the Russian-American colony. So just as in the early 1700s and 1800s, lots of European nations were interested in colonial enterprises in the New World. Russia was no different. When it came to establishing a colony, the Russian emperor actually set out to work with industrialists. So this Russian America colony was really run by the Russian American Company, whose primary purpose was to gather furs in the New World, and this is gathering furs both from hunters on the ground as well as localized trade networks to transport those furs back to actually China and then to distribute the furs among Chinese trade networks, because that's where the largest demand for furs was at the time. When it came to outfitting the colony, many of the colonists were quite notorious in terms of the fact that they couldn't necessarily fit into Russian society. So you have this sort of blend of people who are really independent, and I would say outdoors people coming to the New World, as well as a lot of people who may sort of be on the outskirts of society. And so because of this blend of skill sets and expertise, a lot of the folks who came to Russian America really were not necessarily cut out for working in what is a very skills-intensive place to live and work, and you really have to have a good understanding of both marine and terrestrial resources. Because of that, the Russian American Company relied predominantly on indigenous labor. A lot of the indigenous labor related specifically to knowledge for acquiring furs. So this is trapping on land as well as hunting for marine furs. They also relied on indigenous labor for collecting foodstuffs, for running colony enterprises. Certainly, whenever these Russian ships went out on these voyages looking for marine furs, they were crewed in part by indigenous communities, and it really was an unequal relationship. And so there's this really interesting dynamic that's happening in Russian America between indigenous communities and the knowledge that they possess, and these Russian industrialists is the translation, who were coming over and really trying to make a livelihood, oftentimes relatively unsuccessfully. And so when we think about the SV Nikolai, you have this really interesting dynamic of that crew that washes up on the beach at La Push. We know that the Nikolai's crew was a combination of both indigenous community members from the Aleutian Islands, so that's the Unangan or Unangax peoples, as well as Russians who are on board. There's potentially an American in the mix. When they land on the beachfront, the first community that they encounter is actually the Quileute tribe, who guides them south. They end up spending time with the Ho tribe and then eventually the Macaw tribe before the surviving crew members make it back onto a passing American whale ship and back to Sitka. And because ships were really their home, away from home, we were interested in finding SV Nikolai and thinking about the materials that went into that ship, what would have been carried on board, because it's representative of these different community members coming together, and also the trade that's occurring as the SV Nikolai is traveling down the coast. When it comes to working in coastal Washington waters, there's a really dynamic sort of landscape that is, of course, known to the indigenous communities that are still part of the Olympic Peninsula, but that can be very tricky for vessels such as the Storm Petrel to navigate. The pinnacles and those beautiful cliffs are so evocative of the Olympic Peninsula actually occur underwater as well, where you have these huge rocky boulders and outcrops that make surveying quite a challenge, especially for large vessels. When it came to thinking about the best way to survey these waters and identify potential heritage resources, we came up with a 3-instrument approach. In the middle images, you can see multi-beam sonar, which is essentially an acoustic based survey instrument. It's based on the RV Storm Petrel, so it's launched right from the hull, and it collects sounds that are then translated into imagery of what the offshore bathymetry looks like. So really, we were looking for any pinnacles or rocky obstacles that could impact our survey, especially anything that's being towed in the water. We really didn't want to tow any survey instruments into any submerged obstacles. After we collected the multi-beam sonar data and processed it, we returned to the same survey areas and launched a combination of two instruments. The side scan sonar, which again uses sound waves to translate an understanding of potential materials embedded within the sediment, as well as the magnetometer, which acts sort of like a metal detector, but it's really looking for changes in the Earth's magnetic field that are caused by iron and steel objects, or objects with a high iron content. When we compare these two data sets over each other, the magnetometer really gives us hotspots of areas where there is likely either an object with a really high iron content or an object that's steel. And then we check the side scan sonar image to see if there's anything embedded within the sediment at that area. And so the side scan sonar image looks quite similar to the multi-beam, and now we can see changes in the seabed. Once we collect those side scan and magnetometer data sets, we process them and look for areas again where the two anomalies and targets overlap. Our intent was to send divers in to look at those areas and basically conduct a site assessment. Is there anything there? If it is an object or something that's readily identifiable, is that human-made or human-modified? There is, of course, diving that occurs within Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the beautiful imagery that's been collected. But in the La Push area, everything looks a little bit darker. There's a huge amount of sediment that's entering the nearshore area from the river that empties at La Push. And so any of our dive operations were really impacted by this sort of lowered visibility. Nevertheless, we did complete just about a month of survey operations. For the first 2 weeks, we went out every day with RV Storm Petrel and a survey crew, as well as our marine operations folks, to launch the equipment for that day's survey, whether it was the multi-beam or the combination of the side scan and magnetometer. Because you're working in this really dynamic environment where these storms tend to spin up, we did have a couple of days off the water during that time because we had some really, really high swell coming in off of the Pacific. But any days that we were off the water, we were able to process data and catch up on some of our field notes. We did also have some really wonderful survey days. You can see there's a photo of us surveying off of Dedalia Rock or Dedalia Island, which again is just this really beautiful and evocative scenery. After our 2 weeks of initial survey, where we were collecting our remote sensing data, we came back for a week off the water. We processed all of that data, and we looked for any acoustic targets in the sonar data set. That's anything that looks strange, really, that's embedded within the bottom, and any magnetic anomalies or a concentration of potentially iron or steel objects. With those two lists, we actually went back out with our dive team as well as the Sea Dragon ROV team. The Sea Dragons are a group of young folks who actually participated in the Sanctuary's MATE ROV program. They found a passion for remotely operated vehicles, and now they operate their ROV primarily in the Salish Sea, trying to identify and actually help with the removal of derelict crab traps. So they have close ties to the sanctuary. It was really wonderful for them to come out with us, and again, supporting the next generation of students who are really, really engaged in thinking about ways that we can improve our care and stewardship of marine resources. So we had several days on the vessel with the Sea Dragons team. We also had some divers come out from the NOAA Dive Center. They're located in Seattle, as well as the NOAA Northwest Fisheries Center. They brought out a small boat, and we had some divers from East Carolina University. In total, we mapped just shy of 11 square kilometers with the multi-beam coverage. And that left-hand image, that's those dark shaded areas. And so we mapped both north and south of the river mouth. We decided to prioritize that north area because it was a closer location to the reported lost location of Svyatoy Nikolai. Within our northern multi-beam area, we collected 7.65 square kilometers of side scan sonar and just a little less coverage with the magnetometer because the sonar can see farther, basically on either side of the towfish. In total, we ran about 250 line kilometers of these remote sensing instruments, and from those, we identified a number of those targets to dive on. In total, we looked at 17 targets with the ROVs, and we had 62 diver-led dives. So this is with our dive teams. We basically dove in 19 magnetic targets, trying to identify the source of the magnetism. There's also 2 historic shipwrecks that are located not necessarily within these survey areas, but within close proximity. And because we had a vessel and dive teams there, we decided it would be important to go and conduct condition assessments of these 2 historic shipwreck sites. When it comes to thinking about our findings and what we were able to collect, certainly this project was a success. In short, because of the survey methodology that we were able to implement. So I said before that the nearshore coastal Washington areas are high priority, and part of that prioritization is because they're really difficult to get to. It takes time and resources, and can be dangerous if there's the wrong conditions to operate the vessel. So with our combination of the multi-beam and then the side scan sonar and magnetometer survey combined, we really were able to find a safe way to operate within these areas and to avoid those major obstacles. So on the methodology front, this project was highly successful because I think it sets sort of a path forward for collecting remote sensing data and also ship data in those nearshore areas. The other sort of aspect of these areas and this data that's really important is for, of course, biological habitat and understanding the nearshore habitat, especially the bottom bathymetry. So I'm not an ecologist, but certainly we know from the folks who work as ecologists and are trying to understand fish habitat, bird habitat, things like that, marine mammal habitat, that being able to map these areas and understand sort of the conditions that might facilitate different species is really significant. For our purposes, one of the things that we suspected could be a possibility, but it had just never been documented before, was that there was the likelihood some of the marine sediments could have really high iron content. And that just has to do with how the Olympic Peninsula has formed from a geological perspective. As we started mapping, we did see that this was indeed the case. So here is Dedalia Rock again. You can see on the left-hand side, we've highlighted the magnetometer data. On the right-hand side, you can see some of that underlying bathymetric data. And really, so here's 2 separate magnetic anomalies. And these are areas where the sediments and the rock composition has a really high iron content. What's unfortunate about this sort of underlying geomagnetic feature is that it obscures any potential iron artifacts that could be located within these areas. We know that during the wrecking event of Svyatoy Nikolai, an iron anchor was lost off the vessel. This iron anchor would presumably have a magnetic signature. And of course, if that iron anchor is located in an area with one of these geomagnetic features, and which is really geologic in origin, that it would be impossible for us to pick out that iron anchor from these features. So that makes it somewhat difficult when you are really relying on magnetometer data to give you a good understanding of where historic materials might be that are human-made. In short, we did quite a bit of survey and found no good indication that we located remains of Svyatoy Nikolai. One of the things that we were able to accomplish, though, was a better understanding of some of the historic resources within the sanctuary. In the proximity of La Push, there are two historic freighters which were both lost. The Aleut was a Russian vessel that was lost in 1942 and actually had a pretty remarkable rescue from the local Coast Guard station, who are still stationed in La Push. Temple Bar was a British freighter that was lost in 1943 that had a pretty remarkable salvage operation where they were able to bring in quite a bit of technology that was relatively new for the time because scrap metal was so significant to the war effort. And so both of these shipwrecks have actually been located by recreational divers out of Seattle, but had never been visited by sanctuary staff. So one of the things that we were able to do is to go out and investigate these locations and get a better understanding on the condition of these resources, which do have some significance to the life-saving efforts that have a long history on the Olympic Peninsula. On the left-hand side there, you can see part of the Aleut. There's a significant amount of corrosion that's going on, but the hull remains relatively intact. And due to the site's lost location, there's actually, I would say, a pretty decent likelihood that some really interesting archaeological survey work could be done there. The other site, of course, is the Temple Bar, which is in a much more open area and actually is experiencing much greater rates of corrosion and loss. Part of that has been exacerbated by the historic salvage that occurred in the 1940s. But again, these are two vessels that are relatively contemporary to one each other, but are experiencing very different deterioration and corrosion rates, and I think would have the potential to provide some interesting information about the nature of historic resources that are located within the sanctuary. I also would say that this was a pretty meaningful survey to everybody involved because we had a huge number of folks who came out and represented multiple different areas. So for those first 2 weeks of the project, we had commercial surveyors out with us, as well as staff from East Carolina University and our vessel crew, who really did a remarkable job coming up with this methodology and implementing it in a safe and successful manner. We were also able to involve community participants and observers from the Ho tribe, which was wonderful to both start that relationship building and get a better understanding of future areas where there's potential for collaboration and involvement in thinking about that preservation and celebration of heritage on the Olympic Peninsula. We also had several community members who were able to come out with us who had been involved in those earlier, like 1990s, early 2000s. I think that was really meaningful because they had such wonderful stories from this sort of previous era of shipwreck investigation within the sanctuary. We had an incredible number of divers come out, which is really great. The diving was not easy. It was no easy feat to get out there, but everybody had a really wonderful time. And I think that helped too, because there's so much research to be done underwater within the sanctuary, and to be able to have people who are willing to sort of like bust their chops on it and figure out the best way forward and to persevere through all of it and again come up with really safe and also effective dive protocols was incredible. And then finally, to be able to work with the next generation of marine explorers was truly a meaningful way for us to share our love of operating within these areas and that stewardship. And to see that interest and that excitement in the next generation was pretty wonderful. So again, a huge thanks to everybody who was involved with the project. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie for the last slide.
Yeah, so as part of this grant funding, we were really able to broaden the scope and reach even after the surveys were completed. As part of this funding, we had a West End Maritime Heritage Symposium in Forks, Washington last October. This is something, again, as Maddie noted, there was a lot of research and outreach in the late 1990s and early 2000s around maritime heritage, especially shipwrecks. And part of that, Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary used to co-host a West End Shipwreck Symposium. And one of our partners asked about us restarting these events. And so with this grant funding, we were able to do just that. Last October, we had about 25 attendees. We were able to share the efforts and findings of this research, as well as hear from other folks, including Quinault Indian Nation and Boehm on some ancient coastline work that they're doing down at the mouth of the Quinault River, the findings of the Coast Trader, and the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area Management Plan. And we are now planning our second symposium of this kind this fall, slated for October 19th, again in Forks, Washington, with support from the City of Forks and the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area. So excited to kind of continue these conversations and sharing and learning on the West End. We were also able to add a fall maritime heritage themed workshop for teachers and students in coastal schools here on the peninsula. Those that have been involved with the MATE ROV competition, that's the Marine Advanced Technology Education Remotely Operated Vehicle competition. We were able to have ROV pilots from the Nautilus have a live stream for Q&A with these students who, middle school to high school students that are very engaged in building and competing with underwater robotics. We had a mock shipwreck exploration activity with support from our colleagues at Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And we had presentations from the Sea Dragon ROV team sharing their experience with this project and kind of the career pathways and opportunities for students that are engaged with underwater robotics. During the break in survey days and following this work, we were able to meet with some of the tribal historic preservation offices on the peninsula to discuss areas of mutual interest and where potential collaboration and partnerships could go, pending future funding opportunities and capacity. And this is especially timely for us because Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary is currently working to revise our management plan, which guides our priorities and focus for the next 5 to 10 years. And so we're in the process of drafting our management plan at this point in time in collaboration with a number of partners in our Sanctuary Advisory Council and the Intergovernmental Policy Council, and hope to have a draft out for public review late this year, early next year. Potentially it could get pushed depending, but that would be available for anybody to weigh in on as well. So we just are able to take a lot of the components from this project and continue to advance some of the efforts that were funded through external funding sources and looking at additional future opportunities in this space. So next slide. That is all we have from us. Maddie, I don't know if you want to have any closing remarks.
I don't think so. I think, thank you again, Katie, for just summarizing some of the ways that this project has continued to impact the sanctuary, because I think that's really part of the significance of what we were able to do.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Maddie and Katie. This has been awesome. I'm going to turn it now to our questions and answers portion of the presentation, and I'll have Katie and Maddie come back on camera, and we will get questions started. So I don't see any from the audience right now, but I do have one that maybe everyone else is thinking. Will there be another search for the Nikolai at any point?
I mean, there's definitely the potential to continue to try and locate the remnants of this wreck. I think we would want to include additional partners like Olympic National Park and evaluate how we can expand maybe some of the search area, but also trying to revisit some of those anomalies when maybe there's better visibility for divers. As Maddie noted, that was definitely a limiting factor with this search. And Maddie, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think that you can always search more. There's always more searching to be done. We looked in the area where the vessel was reported lost, but there's always the potential that the crew member misremembered the location, that it was further up the coast. There's also been a significant amount of change around the mouth of the river. So there's another vessel that's actually lost quite close by that used to be visible in the late 1800s. And I think a lot of that is actually under the breakwater that's been established, if it were anywhere. There's also the potential that it was removed and just never reported. And this is, again, a separate vessel. But I think that there is just a lot of change that happens. And there's a huge amount of sediment that's coming out of the actually mountain range, and is just basically just being pumped out of the river. So it's really interesting for nearshore sediment dynamics and how that impacts coastal habitat, but not always the best for looking for shipwrecks.
Great. Thank you for answering my burning question. Was there were both of you on the ship for parts of this adventure?
Yes. We were there for the entire adventure.
That is awesome. That is very exciting. Could you say what was your kind of favorite part of this? Did you guys participate in dives? Were you not just on the vessel, but were you on the vessel, or what were your favorite parts?
Do you want to go first, Maddie?
Sure. So I was a diver. And I have to say, some of the diving was really incredible, especially on the shipwreck sites. The Aleut dives that we did was pretty remarkable because there still is this relatively intact hull structure. And it wasn't only the fact that there was the hull, but that it's an aggregation point for some of the marine species that we hadn't been seeing on other dives. And so to be able to dive on that site and see this different distribution of really fish, that was awesome. That was definitely my favorite day on the water. I know that Katie also had some really great times.
Yeah, so my background is not in archaeology, and so really I feel like I learned a lot in being able to ask questions and be there with Maddie. But some of my favorite parts was just the engagement with the full team. We had so many people join us throughout the survey, especially the Ho tribal members who were able to join us. That was probably one of my most favorite parts, is just being able to share what we're doing and hear their questions, or what they've heard over time, and sharing like the origins of canoe journeys and just other stories. It was a really remarkable experience. And then it was kind of like sleepaway camp a little bit for all of us that were staying in one location after a day of being in the field and processing data, and just getting to meet a lot of colleagues, and also seeing the Sea Dragon ROV team in action, I think was just really inspiring. These young adults who are just very professional and like navigating challenges with visibility and all of these other things on the fly. It was, the whole thing was wonderful.
Okay, thank you. So we got a question into the Q&A panel, so I'm going to show that on the screen right now. So is there any idea of how much recreational diving occurs in the survey area, to your knowledge?
Not anything. We don't have specific metrics. There was a survey done by Washington State about a decade ago, looking at different recreational uses on the coast. And so La Push is definitely a hotspot area because of the access, having a marina. But there's limited dive infrastructure on the Olympic coast. A lot of it is centered inside Puget Sound. So getting dive tanks or dive equipment isn't really possible. So people will drive stuff out. But I would say we don't have specific numbers on what those trends are and that has looked like over time.
Thank you so much. So we have a question in the chat, and I'm hoping it can be reposted into the Q&A so we have that recorded. But I'll read it from the chat. Have there been any paleo shoreline artifacts found within the Olympic National Marine Sanctuary?
There is ongoing work right now. There's been some modeling work on where there could be high likelihood of those resources being present, especially historic coastlines with the changes in sea level over time. And so that is one of the projects that's happening that I mentioned was presented at the Maritime Heritage Symposium last fall, being led by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and Quinault Indian Nation, looking at some of the ancient coastline work. But other than that, there hasn't, within the sanctuary itself, there's been a number of middens explored on land by some of the coastal treaty tribes. But to my knowledge, and Maddie, please correct me, there hasn't been any of that kind of discovery within the sanctuary itself, at least not yet.
Yeah, I would say certainly the most prolific site that has been investigated is the Ozette site, which is north in the northern portion of the adjacent to the sanctuary. It's north of where we were working. And there's been a significant amount of archaeological work there done in partnership with the Makah tribe. And so there's a wonderful resources. And if you're interested, certainly something to look up. And I would say that's certainly probably the most really prolific and robust excavation work that's been done to date.
And I would just highlight, if anyone's interested, the Makah does have a wonderful museum highlighting those artifacts from the Ozette excavation. But that was on land outside of the sanctuary itself.
Thank you. So our next question comes in. This is obviously a challenging search. How many days were lost to weather overall?
I think we'd have to go back and look. I want to say it was 4 to 5 days. That's what sticks in my memory. And some of those days, the sea swell was like 10 to 11 feet, which is just too high for the vessel to operate safely. We know there was at least one day where it was like an 8-foot swell, and we were able to actually position the vessel so that we could still collect multi-beam data. We just had to make sure that our survey lines were oriented to go with the waves rather than like sideways to them. So we were able to actually make up some lost time. But this is, I would say, actually really significant because August traditionally has the lowest sea states and the calmest weather. And that's something that's certainly changing due to climate change. When we were there, it was actually a marine heat wave off the coast that impacted those sea state conditions, and that had been basically brewing off the coast and changed the nature of the nearshore dynamics.
Thank you. So our next question is, I think, getting at that as well, or a question I had. But are your mapping surveys able to include satellite surveys for gas analysis or spectral analysis?
So we don't actually use any satellite survey data. All of our data is collected in water, and that's part of the suite of marine remote sensing instruments that we brought out. There are archaeologists who are incorporating satellite analysis into their research, but because of the water depths that we were looking at, as well as also the visibility in the water, if you have a lot of sediment, things like LIDAR, which is light detection and ranging, is really ineffective in sort of being able to look through the water column. So all of ours, unfortunately, didn't include any satellite data or any of those other analyses.
And that brings up my question, is in a dream scenario, is there a type of technology out there that you would have loved to use?
So there is sub-bottom profiling technology. That's one thing that's been really, really prevalent, especially in recent years when it comes to looking for paleo shorelines. It is a different sort of survey setup and also has different implications to the marine environment. So that would be a potential future technology to bring out. My background and experience isn't necessarily in sub-bottom profiling, so that would have been a different survey team. But I think it definitely has the potential and could yield different results.
And I would just note that not a new technology, but something that I know there's increasing interest in. But building relationships with Indigenous communities and navigating ways to most appropriately access and utilize Indigenous knowledge for some of these surveys as well is something that can be a huge benefit. So I'm not to promote this one project, but I'm really excited to see the results of this work with Quinault on ancient coastlines and how they're working with the community and the Tribal Historic Preservation Office there for some of that survey work.
Again, thank you so much, Maddie and Katie. This has been awesome. I don't see any further questions, and I think we can end a little early, give some people time back in their day. But I want to thank you both for giving this rundown of your search for the Nikolai and also giving us that wonderful kind of back history on the Russian American state at the time. So thank you guys so much. I wanted to see if our coordinator for the ocean exploration series that we're running at the library, Nina, if you have anything you'd like to add in.
Yeah, I echo you. I want to say thank you both so much for sharing your research with us today, and thank you, Katie Poser, for facilitating. And also, I want to thank the audience for all your wonderful questions today. You're very active. I did want to let everyone know that the next NOAA Ocean Exploration Seminar, co-hosted with the NOAA Central Library, will be on August 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And this will feature Doctors Amy Gussick, Jillian Maloney, and Rosalind King, who will discuss their work on the paleo landscapes, paleoecology, and cultural heritage in the Southern California continental shelf. So make sure to mark your calendars, and more information will be coming out shortly. Thank you again, everyone, for today, and we'll see you next time.